all these sessions that we are discussing in class, I am recording them and I'm actually posting them in your class. So if you ever want to review something or you missed a session, if you ever miss a session, you can always, I'm trying to be good about staying on top of it and taking and posting them on YouTube and then putting the links into your academic portal. So when you click like on week 5, for example, you'll see the actual lectures that I recorded on that week. Well, a lot of times I don't record like, just our kind of conversations outside of our class, lecture time, but I will actually record the content, the lecture, okay? So if you ever need that, you have it. You can look it up. It's in the archive there. All right, so we are covering chapter 5 in our textbook, and you guys can track with me. We're talking, this whole chapter is about history, and history, if you read the chapter, you probably walked away with an idea, with understanding why history is so important. The authors make a point of telling us that the words culture and history are actually almost interchangeable. They're kind of connected. History is a huge part of our culture. It's a huge part of who we are, and it has a big imprint upon us as a people, as individuals, and as a society in general. And so studying history and having an awareness of historical heritage helps us to explain people's values, traditions, and institutions, okay? Because if you study a history of the people or a history of a particular country or a culture, it will help you understand why that particular culture works the way it works, why those people behave the way they behave, why those things that are important to them are important to them, while they're not quite the same for you. So again, studying the history of a people, because culture and history are interconnected in a way, is a method of trying to understand other people better, why they are the way they are. And how that feeds into communication is absolutely very directly. The more you understand people and who they are and why they do what they do, the better you're able to connect with them through communicating. There's less miscommunication because now you have proper expectations to know, hey, if I say this person will probably react this way. Well, why would they react this way? Well, because their culture sort of set them up to react this way. They have this value and that value and this value. They have that belief. And that means most likely that they will react this way or that way to whatever I say. So you can sometimes you can almost predict people's behavior and their reactions based on knowing, sort of say, their cultural background and their history. So history is a big part of that cultural background. So speaking about United States and its history is definitely a great example to study first, and to say that Americans are the way they are because of their history. Okay, that is absolutely true. Okay, and so if you're going to study any society, you have to start from the beginning. Where do they come from? And so most Americans actually draw their heritage from European descent. And, historically speaking, today, that may not be true at all. But historically speaking, this country was essentially established by migrants from Europe. Okay, that's who came. And so these European people that came were largely, they're Westerners. Okay, and the entire Western civilization, the entire Western society, let's say most of Europe, is affected in a big way by Greece and Rome. So it's really the Greco-Roman culture is the foundation of the Western civilization and the ways of how Westerners think, feel, believe, behave. So that lays at the very core, the Greco-Roman culture. So if you want to understand the West, You have to understand those classical civilizations, which go deep into antiquity. But essentially, Americans are inheritors of that tradition via the Europe, okay? Because in the end, they're still Europeans. But then as they move to America, they develop their own unique culture, still preserving some of that original heritage, but really now diverging and creating something unique, something different, okay? Of course, because America was developed out of tradition that is European and Western, communicating orally is a big deal. As we talked about in the beginning of the book, oral communication is really a massive, let's say, value for Westerners. Why? Because Greeks valued oral communication above all things. Okay, expressing yourself, speaking well, speaking right, speaking much, actually, is a Western value. And that means Americans are going to be like that because that's their heritage. That's their conceptual world that they come from. So it all actually goes back to Greeks and Romans. But essentially, Americans did develop their own identity. And cultural identity is something that's shared. We've already talked about that. And history is shared. So it's history that shapes our cultural identity. And because we share history, we share those events, those moments that are formative to us as a people. We basically band together, we unify around these ideas. And so the past is important, history is important for that matter. Now, let's see, geography is important in understanding how and where people come from, you know, because a lot of times people's culture is defined by geography, by their orientation to the world. And their identity, their values, their goals, their expectations are all expressions of their unique process of development as a people, as a nation, as a group. It doesn't necessarily always have to tie to a country or a nation per se. It could be an ethnic group, you know, things like that. So that's kind of generally true. All right. So once you understand that people's history is very much a part of who they are, and it makes them the way they are because they're sharing that history with lots of other people, the same culture, then you start understanding some of the issues they have with others. So a good example that the authors use in the textbook is the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. If you want to understand what that is all about, you're going to have to study that history a little bit. And then you will understand why people can't get along. You know, outsiders simply do not understand why until they take the time to, you know, delve into the history of that conflict. So, and then another illustration they give is the fight between the Sunni and Shiites, the Muslims that fight between themselves. And most people who are non-Muslims do not understand what the fight is even about. Like, why do these two groups of Muslims fight with each other? And people's like, I don't know. Why can't they get along? They're Muslims, right? And so for the same reason that Protestants and Catholics are fighting in Ireland, you know, they actually have a full-out war, you know, for the same reason. They have fundamental disagreements that go way, 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 way back into their history, and they cannot make themselves sort of say, they cannot cast off a part of their history any more than they can just say, I'm not who I am. You know, they are who they are. And because of that, they're going to have some cultural conflict and they're going to have to deal with it. So the authors mentioned two assumptions on page 163 that history is predicated on. Okay, that means the history rests on these two ideas. First is that the historical events help explain the character and the actions of culture. Okay, so that's important. Character and cultures of and the actions of culture, like basically what people do, is based on historical events. That is a good assumption. Now, the second assumption is that a culture seeks to remember and pass on to other generations significant things that they believe that account for the values of that culture. Okay, so basically, what the authors are trying to say is that culture will pass on certain features that are foundational for them as, you know, values of that particular culture, and they will do that from generation to generation. So and that's all really a part of history, essentially. So that's a good you know, it's a good precursor. It's a good sort of say intro. So let's get into U.S. history and run through quickly through that. What my plan is to run through the history sections on many of these countries, and maybe then take a break and then finish off the with the Islamic civilization. So that's the idea. Now, U.S. history. On page 164, the authors introduce us to the idea that United States is a country of immigrants. You know, essentially, it's a country that was based on migrations from Europe. Okay, really beginning in, you know, 1600s, and people start migrating to this new land, new open continent, essentially. And of course, it's not uninhabited, but it's still, you know, a new frontier. So what do the cultural features that these newcomers basically, you know, now have? Well, the cultural features that they have is hard work, self-improvement, practicality, freedom, responsibility, equality, and individuality. These new migrants that come from, you know, Europe develop these cultural values, essentially, that now become to characterize the entire population. You know, why? Why do they develop those cultural values? Because their life necessitates them that way. Their conditions, the moment in which they're living, the very idea of resettling this land forces them to be this way. And as they develop those cultural values, later they pass them on. Okay, and that's why most Americans, um, uh, maybe not so much the first generation immigrants or anything like that, but most Americans will basically engender those values, because those are cultural values that are being passed on from the very first settlers, essentially. These are the things that American society thrives on and wants to reinforce. So the settlers who came were predominantly Anglo-Saxon. Okay, that means they're from the English background, from Britain, and they bring together with them the English values. They bring the English system of law, which is, by the way, based on Roman law, if you're wondering, and they bring the basic trade business organization that they knew back then from England. So they basically bring what they knew from England with them, and then they build on that. And so essentially what's unique about America is because other immigrants arrive from other countries, not England, and they integrate into the society, and they add on a little bit of their own distinctiveness, even though I think the English culture maintains the predominance. So as other immigrants come, today, US is very multicultural. But back then, in the early days of settlement, it was mostly European. So, and it's interesting that when people came, they integrated into the culture that was already there forming. And very much throughout the history of US, all the immigrants that came throughout various stages of the development of American society, immigrants tend to conform to the cultural ways of the majority. Even if those cultural ways were not their own cultural ways originally, they tend to conform them. Why? Because they're very generalistic, you know. So the idea of equality, responsibility, individuality, I mean, many of those things are actually foreign to some people who come to us. But they eventually, maybe not in the first generation, second and third generation, absolutely, they embrace and embody those values as Americans. So most of the people who came to America, they were fleeing oppressive regimes of some sort. So whether they're running away from England, because England and the crown is oppressive to them, or they're running away from some other country, or they're seeking freedom of religion, and most of those people were seeking freedom of some sort. Okay, and that's what united them. What united all of those immigrants is the fact that they wanted freedom more than anything. They were sick and tired of being subjugated by somebody more powerful who had all the cards in their hands, and you had nothing. And you had to work within what they gave you, or you didn't survive, basically. So that's what banded Americans. And that's why Americans became individualists. That's why Americans love freedom, because freedom has become the most important thing to them. That's one thing they craved more than anything else. And then when they got it, they said, okay, now I'm not going to let it go. I'm never going back to the way things used to be. So now Americans push their freedom all the way to the extent that many people do not understand, because they're such freedom-loving people as a result of their history, that many other groups and countries and nations do not fully even comprehend why Americans are so crazy about freedom. But they are. And so to some people it seems extreme. Now, if you study the history of the United States, you will learn about Americans, and you learn about these statements about alienable rights and inalienable rights, especially in our Constitution, United States, you will hear those words. So Americans believe that there are some rights that are alienable, meaning you don't have to have them. You can live without them, let's put it that way. And there are other rights that are inalienable, okay? Meaning a human being should not be allowed to live on the face of this earth without having those basic rights. And those basic rights are, expressed in American, Constitution as the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Those are inalienable rights. Everyone has a right to live. I can't take away your right to live. Everyone has a right to be happy, whatever that means to them. As long as it doesn't violate other people. And you should be able to pursue your interests, the things that you want to pursue, as an individual. So basically, American society is built on this idea that these are the things that everybody gets. And while some rights in society may be taken away from you, these cannot. So that's a big deal. And so out of this flows a very strong emphasis on individuality. Americans, one of the values is lack of formality, individuality, lack of formality, and efficient use of time. See, that's Americans. Maybe you have noticed that. That endures throughout the entire American culture from the very beginning. Lack of formality. They really didn't care about, all the procedures and all of the customs that the English, for example, had. They said, I don't have time for this. I don't have time for proprieties. I need to survive. Who cares who you are? You're a duke of what? Whatever. Here in America, we're all the same. We all work hard. We make our money. We survive. So you're a duke. Big deal. So lack of formality and efficient use of time. That comes from the idea of a lot of hard work. If you work really hard to accomplish the things that you need to accomplish to survive, you start valuing your time, and you're saying, my time is valuable. I only have so much time to do this, and if I don't do this now, everything's going to fall apart. So that is a very much an American culture. Why? Because it's a survivalist culture. That's how America got started. And so that value of time is now built into the very fiber of society. Maybe we're not having to survive anymore, but still Americans have that predominant idea of you can't waste time, wasting time, where other cultures would say, what kind of a nonsense is that? You can't actually waste time. And if you wanted to, time is not something that you can waste because we have an unlimited amount of it. So again, different cultures have different ideas, and Americans definitely believe that time is limited and you can waste it. Okay, so other things that are typical of United States is that you have an idea of political freedom, okay, so independence, freedom, personal liberty, all right, rule of law, Rule of law is another feature. All Americans believe in the rule of law. They very much trust it, and also social mobility and egalitarianism. So let me explain those a little bit. Social mobility basically means that people can move from whatever class or position that they find themselves up or down, for that matter. That means billionaires can become paupers and paupers can become billionaires. All right? That means you could be a nobody today, and in 10 years, you can be the richest man in this country. All right? And that's something that's possible in America, while it's really not possible in a lot of other countries. And the reason why it's possible in America is because Americans value that, they believe in it, they embrace it, and they make it possible. They accept people who succeed, who work hard, who achieve. Americans love a story of somebody coming and making something of themselves, and they celebrate that person, they support that person, they get behind that person, they affirm them, okay? Where there are in other countries, that may not always happen. But Americans, because of the way they are, they very much believe that anybody can make it. And just because this is the lot you've been given in life doesn't mean you have to live with it. Change it. You can change it. And so that's a big American value. A lot of other cultures don't believe in that. Other cultures would say, okay, this is how you were born, and that's what you're going to be for the rest of your life, and you can only go this far and no further. That's it. You achieve this much. The rest is out of reach. Maybe you can step up a little bit in one generation, and maybe the next generation can step up a little bit, but that's about all. So in America, it's kind of a little bit different. So the whole idea of mobility socially through the classes, sort of say, and egalitarianism. Egalitarianism is the idea where there's equality between people, equality between genders, things like that. That's very much an American value. Now, it hasn't always been, let's put it that way. And even though Americans have always embraced that idea, they haven't always practiced it really well. So keep in mind, ideals are not always translate to, perfect life. But that's Americans. That's what makes them, who they are. And so the idea of individualism and rugged individualism, if you've seen it before, it's portrayed that way. Maybe it's not exactly what it is, but because people were pioneers, because people moved to this country, moved in on a new piece of land, developed it, and built a farm, and started making something out of nothing, that's where this comes from. So Americans are very independent, very individualistic, because of the early history of this nation and how people developed those values. So, as I talked about, individualism, then disdainful formality. If you noticed, in American culture, people are very informal. Even American language is very informal. People don't always address each other as sir and madam and this and that and big titles. So like you go to Germany and like nobody gets addressed, like that. Like you have to have a proper title for the person, and you have to properly pronounce their name and say everything just so. In America, they just look at you and say, hey, you, hey, you. And that's okay. That they think that that's polite. They think that that's normal. To them, this is not disrespectful or anything like that. They're like, I don't have time to learn your name and title and all the important things of who you are. And so what are you, a PhD, an MD, a DDS, whatever you are, whatever the letters that come after your name, like that's not as important. Hey, you, I'm talking to you. So it's like Americans are informal. They're informal in addressing each other. They're informal in dress. If you noticed, the way Americans dress is informal a lot of times. The whole suit and tie thing is only a segment of the culture. Most people dress down. It's not a big deal. I mean, I have students coming to my classes in flip-flops all the time. I come from culture that's way, way more formal. I was born and raised in Russia, so if I walked into a classroom in flip-flops, I would walk right out of that classroom immediately. And they would send me back, and they say, go put on some proper clothes and then come back. I mean, they would kick me out, literally. I would never be able to walk into university campus in shorts and flip-flops. I would have to be dressed up. So it's just like that's a culture, And so, but in America, it's like, yeah, I just crawled out of bed, I put on my pajamas, and I walk into a classroom. Now, of course, now we're doing this this distance education, and we're learning through digital means. And for all intents and purposes, yeah, you could be wearing your pajamas sitting in front of me here, which is fine. But it works in America. Americans tend to be casual about these things. So, and Americans love freedom, and that can sometimes get pushed to the extreme in the sense that anything that violates my freedom, anything that violates my expression to be who I am, and that may include wearing the clothes that I want to wear or getting tattoos on my forehead, anything that violates my freedom, I'm going to push back on. Why? Because you can't tell me I can't do this. It's wrong for you to tell me that I cannot pierce my nose, with a big, huge, bone going through it or something like that. I guess, I understand that there's people out there, doing things that you may not approve of or you may not like, and they're expressing themselves in a direction that some people get rubbed wrong. But that is a part of American culture. You can't tell me how to dress. You can't tell me how to look. You can't tell me this. And yes, with that comes, there's a price that comes with that. But Americans believe in freedom so much that they actually believe that it is wrong for somebody to tell somebody else that they shouldn't look the way they look, or they shouldn't dress the way they dress, or they shouldn't behave the way they behave. So sometimes they get pushed to an extreme, and it really, people struggle with that part of American freedom. But that is freedom. Freedom is a two-way road, as I try to tell people. You are free not to like what I do, but I am free to continue doing it. So it really is a two-way road. And yes, there are consequences, but in America, you're not supposed to criticize people and tell them, oh, you can't do this and this and that. You can't be this and this and this and this way, because people will take that as an offensive. And they can say, what do you mean I can't? I'm free. I'm a free individual. You don't have the right to tell me what to do or what not to do. So, and so people believe in their free choice and their freedom to express themselves however they wish. And essentially, that's a huge part of American society. Now, Americans tend to be very assertive, and Americans tend to be sometimes perceived in the rest of the world as aggressive. I like to call it assertive. Other people like to call it aggressive. Why I say assertive? Because Americans are goal-driven. They're very tenacious. They're Americans, by and large, as a country, as a culture, as a people, they're oriented towards achievement. And so this idea that in 1800s, basically, America developed this idea called manifest destiny. If you haven't run into this before, you'll run into it in history books for sure. But the idea of manifest destiny is that you can go and make something, and you can sort of say, expand your influence. And so that is still very much a part of American culture, expanding American influence, even well beyond the borders of America. And Americans have done that in a very powerful way. They have actually influenced a lot of different peoples and cultures, and still continue to do so in a variety of different ways through this notion of manifest destiny. Now, other countries have colonized. Historically, countries, especially European cultures, have always colonized, and this is how they express that value that European culture has. Spaniards come and colonize Latin America, right? They take over the whole entire place, literally. Englishmen do the same. Englishmen take over India, the whole of Asia, Australia. All of those countries used to be all English. Dutch go for Africa, and so all these Europeans basically take over other parts of the world. And that is, again, a cultural value of extending your influence and taking over, essentially. And so Americans are no different. Why? Because they're the descendants of that same tradition. So Americans, expanded their territory largely through war and acquisition. Some land was bought, other land was conquered and just taken away, just like all other nations have expanded and extended their borders through war, through political conflict. So because of that, Americans are perceived as aggressive, and that is, again, a part of culture. You can't really take it away. It's who people are. Or you can call it assertive, but Americans definitely go after what they want. And they do not believe in keeping their influence to themselves. They actually believe in moving on other people's turf and influencing them. So they definitely believe that. All right. So another strong part of American culture that everyone should understand is the desire for change and innovation. It is absolutely relentless in the United States. Americans love to innovate and they love to change things. In fact, nothing stays the same. If you don't change, you die. Every company changes, every business changes, sometimes on a weekly basis. Okay. If you haven't noticed that there, some cultures tend to keep things the same, continuity as much as they possibly can. Don't change anything until it's completely broken and it's not working. We're not going to do anything. Americans are the only crazy people that would take the house and gut it completely and rebuild it, and make new kitchens, new bathrooms, new everything when things are still working and they're not broken. Americans will do that. I mean, you watch HGTV, right? That's what they'll do. They'll take a perfectly fine house just because it's outdated. Everything works. They just rip it all up, throw it in the trash, and build a whole new kitchen. You show it to another culture, and they're like, "Are you insane? I'd kill to have a kitchen like that." Everything is working. Everything is fine. So what? It's a few years old. Big deal. But that's Americans. America's got to have everything greatest, everything latest, change, innovation. I don't want to live in the past. I don't want to live, that's culture. That's why Americans do what they do, and that's why they, keep forging forward in their progress, while other countries tend to hang back because they don't have that same value of innovation. So there's a lot of great things to say about history and culture that makes people who they are, and it actually makes them achieve things that other people don't achieve. And this is not a criticism of other cultures. It's just saying that our culture, whatever it may be, a lot of times defines our ability to succeed and progress, however we define success or however we define progress. But if you define it in American terms, then certainly your culture will, either help you or it will hurt you in becoming something or not becoming something, achieving something or not achieving something. Americans are definitely into achievement and, moving forward and innovation, coming up with new things, inventing new stuff all the time, nonstop. And that's the American spirit. So that's what makes this country unique, and really involved in everybody else's lives, essentially, because then everyone benefits from somebody inventing something. When somebody invents an iPhone, now the whole world uses them. What's going on? Why couldn't China invent iPhone? I don't know. Why couldn't Korea invent iPhone or Japan? Well, they didn't. Americans did, and now the whole world uses it, and the whole world knows this American company. Why couldn't Russians develop, Google? Oh, wait a minute. The guy who developed Google is Russian. But he does not choose to live in Russia or be a citizen of Russia for a very good reason. But the idea is like, why can't these countries lead in this area? Why can't they invent? Why does internet function in English and not French, for example? Or something like that. I don't know, some Chinese characters. I'm sure there's an idea. It's like people are driven to innovation. They're going to create structures. They're going to create new things that other people will use, because other cultures will say, oh, somebody invented this. Why should I invent this? I'm just going to use what they invented. So, and cultural interborrowing is normal, and we always have done that. And Americans are very good about borrowing from other cultures as well, but they don't just borrow. They also create something new. They develop to take it to the next step. So anyway, these are features of American culture. I find Americans fascinating. Like I said, I'm very Americanized myself. I've been living in this country for quite a few years. Well, basically since my college years. And I admire American culture. I'll be honest with you. I'm a big admirer of American culture. I think they have something that's absolutely amazing and unique And there's really not a culture like that in the world anywhere else. So very much admired. And the success of America is built on those cultural values, if you don't think about it. The prosperity of America is built on those values. And that's why a lot of other countries try to emulate American prosperity, but fail because they don't carry the same cultural values that make them so. You can't be something you're not, essentially. And that's why, people give up and just move to America. And say, if I want to be successful, I can't create success in my country and replicate it. I'm just going to move to America and do it there. All right, so Americans are faced with a number of issues. America is not really the Anglo-Saxon country anymore. One of the things that we have to understand is America is a very multicultural society, and majority of the people living in America today are not Anglo-Saxon white Europeans. All right, it's changed. And that challenges the fiber of America, although the values that I've just described will be embraced by all people regardless of their cultural background. So, but there are some challenges, and with that, the culture of America is changing. Some of the smaller, minor values are definitely being challenged. So, the freedom of choice, is a big contention right now. We have the whole idea of choice and same-sex marriages and school prayer and abortion, all these things that are being debated over and over and over in our culture. And those are cultural conflicts, believe it or not. They're just happening within American society. So the big cultural clash right now in America that goes on is really between secular and religious. Majority of Americans describe themselves as religious people. Whether they truly are religious or not, I don't know. But at least they think they are. So at least most Americans, if they asked, they would say, oh, yes, I'm a religious person. I'm a spiritual person. Whether they live it is a different story. But at least they believe it about themselves, and they're certainly not anti-religion and anti-things like that. And so because their religious overlook our view of life and everything like that, they are the way they are. While there's a segment of population that's secular and does not want to have anything to do with religion, and that's what the battle is really all about, is between those two segments of population. All right, so that's America. Let's talk a little bit about Russian history. Let's see, Russia is a huge country, and the geography of Russia and geography of America are very different. So, of course, America is surrounded by the oceans, okay, on the left and the right? So east and west is oceans. So that insulates America in many ways. America has neighbors to the south and, and to the north. And to the north is a very friendly neighbor, Canada, and to the south is Mexico, which is also a very friendly neighbor. Not always have been, but for the most part, they are. So again, and so Americans feel very secure as a result. And so that makes geography of the United States actually contribute to the culture of the people. And it's a very large country too. So again, that allows people to expand, spread out, stretch out. There's places in America where you can buy massive amounts of land and do something that you really want to do and exercise your freedom. If you don't want to live next to people, you can buy a whole bunch of land and live on it and never see another human being if you don't want to. So in other countries, that may not be possible because they don't have that much land. Well, one of the countries that has way more land than the United States is Russia. Russia is huge, larger than the United States, probably twice, maybe even more. So I was born and raised in Siberia. And when people ask me what Siberia is like, I try to tell them, well, it's kind of like the United States. It's like saying, what's America is like? Well, if you go to Maine and then you go to Florida, those are two different things. So it's a huge country. Asking people what Siberia is like is kind of silly because it's huge. It's the size of the United States, essentially. So Russia is a big country, and because of its size, it has developed a particular culture. There's nobody could ever truly conquer Russia because just how big it is. I mean, you have to be massive as a nation to be able to conquer an entire country. So people have conquered portions of Russia throughout history, but never the whole country. Then if you conquer it, you can't hold on to it, because to control such a massive territory, you'd have to have an army of literally billions of people who would just have to, the whole time, full time, stay in control of somebody else. And so population is large, territory is large, lots of spread out places. But Russia is also vulnerable with its territory where they are. Always have been invaded by the armies from both European side and Asian side. So throughout the whole history, people from Mongolia and China have kind of pushed into Russia, invaded Russia, and the same thing with Europeans. Any European nation can push into Russia and basically start conquering. And those are the vulnerable sides of Russia. And so as a result, Russia has developed, some, let's say, strong military notions. A large amount of Russian effort is going to defend itself militarily, create a strong army, create a very aggressive industrial military complex to create new weapons, new armaments, and basically be ready for an attack. Why? Because that's the history of Russia. They've been attacked many times from, the East and the West, mostly. Nobody attacks from the North because you have the Northern Sea there, and not too many people attack from the South because, you have a lot of Muslim countries and India and things like that to the south of Russia. So that historically has not been as much of a problem. So an interesting fact about Russia, while America is all democratic and individualistic and things like that, Russia has been autocratic. That means Russia has always had very strong leaders, very powerful leaders, who kind of rule with an iron fist. I tell you what to do, and you do it. And if you don't do it, well, there's price to pay. And then many throughout history, many leaders of Russia have been strong and very brutal and very ruthless and punished people very harshly whenever they did not obey. So as a result, Russian population developed an expectation that that's what a leader's supposed to do, number one. And number two, that this is how things are, and you don't fight it, because if you fight it, well, guess what? You're going to lose. That's the idea. So historically speaking, Russia has always had, in its brightest moments of history, it's always had very, very strong leadership, which hasn't always been great for the people, but it has molded and shaped the culture in a certain way. And so in some ways, it has also given Russians sort of a defeatist attitude, sort of say a passive idea of, I can't change anything, so I'm just going to sit here and do nothing. So that's another side of Russian culture that people have to understand. So if you look at the history of Russia, then you'll understand. Basically, Russia started as a country that was just groups of cities, city-states, mostly European parts, that band together for a short period of time because the attacks of the Mongols. And so they band together, they created a confederacy, and eventually moved their center to Moscow. And that sort of created a political hierarchy, eventually created a king, a czar is what he's called in Russian. And so you had the dynasties of the czars, and then came the revolution, Bolshevik revolution in 1917, and Russia turns from monarchy to communism. So created a huge mess, complete disarray in a country. Everything's destroyed. The classes are flipped upside down. All the rich people are dispossessed, killed, murdered, scattered, and so all the populace that were poor now inherit everything. And so it sets up a communist system which basically breeds massive amount of corruption, does not get rid of the classes, does not get rid of poverty. The collective farming, where the land is owned by the community rather than owned by individual proprietors, does not produce the economic prosperity. And as a result, Russia continues to be an impoverished country where people suffer and they don't have enough. And so that economic system did not work. And so in 1991, Communist Party breaks up, and there is a big push for democracy. Russia becomes a democratic republic. But after a few years of experimenting with capitalism, not really knowing what to do, and never having been a country that was truly democratic, that experiment fails as well, with a new authoritarian leader rises up and takes Russia under its full control. So you know him today as Vladimir Putin. He is the, I guess, prime minister now of Russia or something like that. You know, he's changed his titles many times because he became a president. The president had 2 terms, and then he finished his terms. He wanted to continue to be in charge, so they amended the constitution and made him a prime minister, and he still continues to run the country, even though he outserved the terms that the constitution provided him. So essentially, now we have another authoritarian, autocratic ruler who tells everybody what to do, and he rules with the iron fist. You know, harshly subduing any dissent, any type of adversaries that come against him. Anytime he's challenged, anytime there's opposition, well, they end up dead. Let's put it that way. They're dead. They're gone. They're out of the way. They can't challenge him. He makes sure that nobody challenges his authority. So essentially, we have another strong leader, just like we've always had throughout the history of Russia, that rule with an iron fist and do what they want, and everybody else goes along. So that is the history, that repeats itself. So because of that, because of this type of pattern, many Russians feel like they don't really have control over what's going on in their lives. So there's a culture of, I would say, depression, honestly. That's why a lot of Russians drink a lot. There's a huge problem. This is like epidemic proportion problem where especially male population basically drink themselves to death. They don't live past 50s or 60s. Why? Because they drink such massive amounts of alcohol that they basically destroy their own health. And the reason why they drink is because they feel worthless. They feel that they can't control their own life. They're depressed. So to deal with that depression, they medicate themselves with alcohol, essentially. And as a culture, it's a huge, huge problem. Drunkenness, alcohol abuse is a massive cultural reality in Russia that, essentially is destroying and undermining culture in a very substantial way. So because of the communism, because of all the things that happened in Russia, and today Russia is focused on patriotism, statism. It's all about state. It's collectivism as well. It's about the greater good of the many, rather than individual freedom. So very different from America in that sense. And statism is another issue where the state really is in charge of things. People look to the government to provide the basic structure of society. They don't look to themselves to create something new. They're looking to the government, which simply reinforces the idea of authoritarian government that continues to tell you what to do in every aspect of life. So, there's positive side effects to that culture. People turn to other things. If they feel like they have no control over their political destiny, they turn to art. So, for example, a lot of, you're probably familiar with Russian art. You're probably familiar with Russian music, ballet, whatever. It's like there are many expressions that come out of Russian culture that a lot of people in the world have experienced, and they are side effects of their historical development. Because people feel powerless in certain areas of their life, they flourish in other areas of their life. So by creating beautiful music, for example, or something like that. So you got to do what you got to do to deal with your issues. So, and as you look at Russia today, it continues to practice it in that same pattern of cultural values that they have. Their Russian expansion that exists today is not built on the idea of manifest destiny like it is for Americans. It's built an idea on military protection. So Russia tends to be aggressive in creating outposts that are military outposts. So if you're wondering why there has been a conflict going on between Ukraine and Russia, for example, why did Vladimir Putin wants to annex Ukraine? Why there are things going on in Georgia and Armenia and places like that? Is because those are strategically important military areas. Russia is trying to create buffer zones and trying to protect itself, the mainland, from attack by creating those strategic areas. Why are Russians fighting with Japanese over some silly little tiny islands, for example. They've been fighting with Japanese forever over that. Russia does not really need more land. They have plenty of land. It's not the land issue. It's strategic military defense. That's really what it's about. And so you will see a lot of that aggressiveness in the Russian culture when it comes to military defense. So they're motivated by different things than Americans as far as that expansion. So as I said, there's a lot of problems. There's social, economic problems in Russia. There's still a huge disparity. The experiment of capitalism in Russia worked to an extent, but it also left a huge gap between people who have a lot and people who have nothing, essentially. So huge drug problem, huge alcohol problem, and now there's this new totalitarianism where a government is absolutely intolerant of dissent, where basically if you do not follow in what they say, that basically you become a problem, and people will oppress you and eventually persecute you, and that's it. They do not tolerate dissent. So again, we're back to that with notions of freedom and democracy. We're back to Russia is back to its totalitarian ways. So you could see that's kind of how they are. So if you want to understand Russians, this is a big part of who they are. Why Russians are the way they are is because of their history, because of how life has changed their world over and over and over. And so in case you wonder, again, now you have an insight into a Russian culture. Okay, good. So moving on, Chinese history. Let's talk about Chinese. Basically, China right now is exploding and booming. Everyone talks about China because China is experiencing an era of unprecedented economic growth. China is becoming the world's largest economy. Not really, not 100%, but adjusting for the purchasing power, let's put it that way. Americans still spend more money, okay, because they have higher salaries, let's put it that way. But Chinese spend more money, because they have more people. Let's put it that way. And that's, but China is a massive economy now, and it's really changing how China is influencing the world. China is able to influence the world today by the sheer size of its apparatus. So 20% of the world's population, okay, 20% of the world's population. That's huge. I can't even wrap my mind around it. That's the power of China. That's why China is the largest economy in the world today, is because just how many people there are. So China is a very, very ancient people. People trace this Chinese society to some sort of a organized semblance of Chinese society to 7,000 years BCE. Okay, 7,000 years BCE. That's a lot. This is a very, very ancient society. We're talking about before Abraham. Okay, that's far. Okay, that's really far. So very ancient. Some people say it's the oldest of world's civilizations. Okay, definitely true, probably. So now China's territory is larger than the United States. Now imagine 20% of the population of the world now fitting into a territory that is, slightly larger than the United States. You could see how now it's a lot more crowded. Where America has lots of places that you can spread out, China doesn't have that. So China's geography, you have mountain ranges to the north, mountain ranges to the southwest. You have the Himalayan mountains, the south, and then you have ocean to the southeast and east. So China has some pretty natural borders that allowed it to maintain sort of independence and sort of being able to isolate in many ways. And so because of the Chinese isolation and because of the strength of their civilization, Chinese developed sort of say an internal culture there where they didn't really have much interaction with people outside. They were sort of say interacting within themselves, and they didn't really need outsiders. Now, number one, many outsiders could not come to China because of how their borders are set up. And then beyond that, they didn't really need them because they had so much going on the inside. So for many, many years, for thousands of years, China was fairly isolated from the outside world. They developed their own unique culture without others meddling and influencing them, essentially. And so Chinese looked at their country as the center of the world because as far as they're concerned, that was the whole world, because they didn't even know about the whole world outside of their world because they never left their world. Okay. In fact, this is how a lot of Americans are today. A lot of Americans never leave the United States, never travel anywhere, never go anywhere. They imagine that they are the center of the world. In fact, they're their own world. And so we laugh a lot of times with Americans, saying how limited they are in understanding of the world. It's because they're surrounded by oceans, on both sides, and then have Canadians and Mexicans for friends, and that's it. That ends right there. They don't need anybody else because they have everything they need. So they never have to leave and go to Europe or do anything else over there. So in that sense, China was a lot like that for generations and generations and generations, thousands of years of this internal culture that we don't really need anybody. So there was imperial rule. Of course, there were ruling dynasties that were developed, and that developed a very clearly defined hierarchy and very clearly defined bureaucracy. Okay, so there's layers and layers and layers of classes that basically existed in ancient Chinese society, and very large bureaucracy, very big organization. So Chinese, because of their isolation, became very ethnocentric, very much distrusted anybody. Foreigners did not import foreign products. And so as a result, when China started to interact with foreigners, they developed a policy where they did not import goods into China from other countries, because again, they were very focused on themselves. They didn't want any outside influence, but they started exporting, essentially. And so people came to China and took things away, but China didn't get anything in return except money, but they didn't take goods in. And as a result, their culture, developed these very unequal trade relationships, let's put it that way. And then later on in history, those unequal trade relationships were forced upon them militarily. And basically that created a very big dislike for Westerners in general, and very big distrust of trading with Westerners, because those unequal treaties that were forced upon them militarily basically created that, sense. And so for Chinese, they still remember that very much because it's a big part of their history, and they know that. So China did begin to modernize, interact more with the outside world, probably, eventually. But before that, there was an era in China where basically communists took over. The dynasties went away. Communism became the way in China. And for a long time, communism was an experiment that did not work, essentially, because people became poorer and poorer and poorer. And it did not move China forward economically at all. So eventually, Chinese did modernize and adopt a Western model of free market economy. And that's when China exploded. So what we're seeing right now is because Chinese moved away from the notions of collective farming and, running basically businesses through the state, and bureaucratically operating everything from central control. When they got away from that, when they went towards the market economy, and started trading with the West, truly trading with the West, not just sending stuff out, but bringing things in, and creating really, really strong, powerful ties. That is what created China to be the economic powerhouse that they're today in the world. So essentially, that's what we're seeing. That's the effect of those decisions on the part of Chinese people. So China has a lot of problems because, like other countries, they are growing, and they're growing too fast. Their population or their urbanization is doubling. People are moving out of the countryside. Huge agrarian lifestyle that people have basically practiced for thousands of years is now falling on the wayside, and people are working in factories and living in cities, small apartments. Now there's a huge pollution problem because so much of the industrial production is being done, and people are trying to do things economically, and that means that they are cutting corners with safety, cutting corners with basically having large amounts of waste that are destroying their land, destroying their air, polluting their waters. And so they have become an industrial production powerhouse, and as a result, there's a side effect. They're destroying their own land, and they're making their own people sick. And so that is a huge problem in China, believe it or not. And it's a side effect of basically developing the way they are and growing too fast. They can't do it in the right way, so they're just doing it any way they can. And as a result, cutting corners, it hurts the people and the land health-wise. Ecology is just, being ravaged right now. So essentially, there's a lot of social and cultural issues in China today. While China is prospering and a lot of people are being lifted out of poverty, there's a lot of degradation going on at the same time. A lot of people are leaving. There's a lot of people are trying to leave China and work somewhere else, move on, move out, because they're seeking even better opportunities. And so the very fiber of Chinese traditional society is now being eroded because traditionally Chinese have relied on children supporting their parents, but children are now moving overseas. Children are now living in cities, in small apartments, and the birth rate in China, has been curbed artificially. A law was passed that a couple cannot have more than one child. So if you only have one child, how would that one child take care of two parents? You could see how that creates a little bit of a mathematical difficulty. It's very difficult because you have two parents, two elderly parents to take care of, and you only have one child. You keep multiplying that, you have a very small amount of people taking care of a very large amount of people eventually. So the whole idea, the cultural notion of, children caring for their parents is being eroded. Why? Because of how society has chosen to limit the birth rate and things like that. So you have a disproportionate number of males versus females. Why? Because again, the value of the male children historically has been sort of put forward. And so as a result, I guess Chinese policy of abortions and selective abortions and things like that made it, disproportionate essentially. So they have a lot of problems, like many other countries. Each country faces their own unique challenges, and those are Chinese challenges essentially. All right, so that's a little bit about Chinese history. Let's talk about Japan. Japan is a very, very unique country, and what makes it so incredibly unique is geography. The fact that it's a very small country and a country that is basically positioned on tiny little islands is part of it. Part of who Japanese are is because how their geography arranged them. Okay, imagine being a tiny little islands. The only way people can access is by sea. So for so many generations, Japanese continue to live in those islands and nobody's bothering them. Why? Because the only way you can bother them is by ocean. And until people developed basically fleets and military power that moved on water, they were pretty much left alone and isolated. And they developed their own very, very unique culture, living off the land, sort of say, and because they didn't have a lot of land, they had to cooperate a lot. So it's definitely collectivistic, definitely a very cooperative culture, and very isolated from the outside world. Japanese became very self-focused. They were more about themselves and really didn't have much use for the rest of the world. So because nobody's coming to China. I mean, nobody's coming to Japan. Nobody's coming to live there because they're hard to get to. Let's put it that way. So essentially, Japanese had a very interesting position because of their geography. Okay, so the isolation of Japanese culture for many years basically created this homogeneous culture that is so oblivious and ambivalent to foreigners. They don't really have use for foreigners, actually. And so that is a feature of Japanese culture that continues until today. And it's strange, but the culture where everyone is the same, where people are more the same than different, where, I mean, for Americans, this is completely wild and crazy. I'm sure for Brazilians, it's also very crazy to have one people of one kind, and that's it. And everyone is the same. It's just like, you cannot imagine that, because you're coming from a very diverse multicultural society where people don't look the same, don't feel the same, don't speak the same, don't like the same food. And yet there are many things that unite them, but they're so different, where Japanese are not like that at all. They're more the same than different, you know, and everyone is more or less on the same page. So, so foreigners, whenever they would come to Japan, today even, are looked upon as some, you know, curious attractions. You know, who are you? I mean, there's many people have never even seen a foreigner, you know, and that happens. It's normal. It's in cultures that are isolated like that, there's a fascination with foreigners. I mean, there's many cultures experience that, but for Japanese, it's pretty typical. So when they see a foreigner, they don't really know what to do with one. They don't know how to interact. They know exactly what to say to another Japanese person, but they don't know what to say to a person who is not Japanese. They don't know how to treat them right. And because of that, sometimes they end up ignoring people and just not wanting to have any interaction with outsiders at all. So because they don't know how to behave, essentially. So foreigners in 2014, foreigners represented less than 2% of the population of Japan. So that means everyone else is Japanese. So that tells you how very few outsiders there are, even in 2014. So that's kind of crazy. It's a very homogeneous society, very much a society that's very uniform. And so Japanese were organized around a hierarchy that they have developed themselves. And their hierarchy groups are samurai, farmer, artisan, and merchant. And that's historically how they were. And actually still today, very much that those same classes still continue in Japanese society, even though, you know, nobody's really a samurai today. But there's still these classes that exist, essentially. Let's see. Japanese developed a culture because they were so isolated and they were so, kind of say, within themselves. They developed a culture where everybody is taught a way to perform a task right. There's a right way to dress. There's a right way to cook. There's a right way to serve tea. There's a right way to bow. There's a right way to do everything, you know. And so, and everyone started doing those things in a very uniform way. Why? Because to a Japanese culture, keeping harmony became one of the most predominant values. And so if I behave the same way you behave, we do not have as many disharmonies. We don't have arguments. You know, if I do things exactly the same way you do, and it creates a sense of comfort and familiarity, and we don't seem to have conflict because that's, you know, it's the same. So greater social good, social stability, societal stability are the paramount objectives in Japanese culture. It is central to being Japanese, is to keep that harmony, keep things going, you know, in this balanced way. So, you know, as we move into the modern world, you know, people continue to behave in the same way. Like I said, there is interaction now more with Japan and other countries, and Japan has modernized in many ways. You know, historically, Japan has been a monarchy, first ruled by clans, and then later a monarchy. And now, as they modernize, they try to emulate Western countries. Japan really wanted to be more like the West. Actually, after the Westerners came and kind of took over, because they came with their ships and they took over, and the Japanese realized that they're in a great position of disadvantage. And so they tried to become more like the Westerners. They built up military power, and that backfired on them because they got involved in the world wars. And in the end, you know what happened in the end of Second World War. That devastated Japan, where Americans basically fought back. You know, Japanese attacked in Pearl Harbor, attacked America, picked a fight with a really big guy. And, you know, being a small, you know, chain of islands, isolated, they thought they were protected. Well, Americans flew over their bombers and dropped nuclear bombs upon them, you know, and that devastated Japanese cities. And I think after that, Japanese did not want to fight anymore. They realized that they cannot engage in war in the same way Western countries engage in war, because that is not within their culture. And so that has shaken the Japanese life. They realized that they were about to lose everything. They can't be the kind of, you know, military power that other countries could be because of who they are. And so they realized they were going to lose it all. And so essentially, I think culture has reverted a lot. But that caused a indescribable calamity for Japanese people and a huge cultural shift, essentially. So Japanese still face a number of problems. They are definitely overcrowded. They don't have enough space. The globalization is changing how families work. I think that's a lot for a lot of people right now. The nuclear families are sort of say being, you know, created, and extended families are being disrupted, and so the whole idea of clans is now being changed. There's an aging population problem. There's a birth rate problem because you have a growing aging population and not enough young people being born to kind of support them. People obviously, whenever that happens, you know, Europe is going through the same problem. So what does Europe do? Europe increases immigration, right? Europe starts bringing people from all over the world to solve their problem of not enough, you know, workers, aging population. So they start importing people, right? Essentially. But what do you do when you're a culture who does not like outsiders? You can't bring in outsiders because you don't like outsiders. You don't want outsiders. Deep inside, you want to keep things Japanese. You want to keep this harmony. Bringing outsiders means introducing disharmony into your system. So Japanese are stuck. They're stuck because they need to move forward and fix their social problems, but they can't fix their social problems the same way everyone else is fixing them because they're so averse to foreigners and outsiders. So they're having a problem. Their ethnocentric culture is fighting the globalization and internationalism that is now really taken over the whole world. So it would be interesting to see what happens next, but this is kind of where they are stuck today. All right, so that's Japanese. Let's highlight Indian culture now and talk about some of the important features of that culture. Let's see. Indian history, again, very, very ancient. It goes way, way into antiquity, and it's actually, we don't really have a lot of records that go that far. But as the history of the people, India is kind of unique. There's like these waves of migration that come into India, and one of the waves of migration that comes in is really what makes the Indian culture as we know it today. And that's actually European tribes coming into India and mixing with the local populations that are there that create a unique Indian culture. You probably have met a number of Indian people in your life, and you probably have seen how diverse, how different they look. Some Indians are darker, some Indians are lighter, some Indians tend to have European features, but then at the same time, they'll have very dark skin tones. Well, that's because of how Indian culture was formed, of essentially melding and blending of the two different groups of people. And so Indians are, in that sense, a very, very unique people. They have diversity, sort of say, within themselves. That's very, very great. So Indian culture is important to highlight. The textbook highlights studying them is because there's 3 million American Indians currently live in the U.S. Plus, the population of India is so massive that not to study their culture, not to study their history, is kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because you will meet people from India. You will interact with people from India. If you haven't already, and you're not an Indian, you will encounter them, and knowing how to interact with them, knowing who they are, where they come from, what makes them who they are, will allow you to be more successful in your interactions with Indians. So definitely, worthwhile studying. So 1.2 billion people live in India. That's a lot. And the country strikes, the textbook strikes a point to say that this is the world's largest democracy. And it's true. It's largest because we're talking about 1.2 billion people. It's a true democratic republic today, and hasn't always been so. And it's very, very diverse. One of the things about India to understand is how unlike Japan, where everybody is the same, India is completely not like Japan. There are so many groups within India. There's so many tribes and tribal languages and ways of doing things. It's like almost every village is different from another village. And that creates a problem too, because when you don't have unity, it's hard to get things done. And then you have a number of religions in India represented. Anything like, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Sikhism, Jainism. There's so many groups, and you can't probably list them all, but it's very, very diverse population within India. The regions of India are different from each other. So where Japan and everybody's more or less the same, in India, everybody's different. And so with that comes their own challenges. So like I said, India is an ancient culture. When Europeans came and settled and blended, sort of say, with the local population, they created their own civilization, but their own civilization wasn't so well organized in a sense. There were still a lot of small city-states, small rulers, regional powers. So, for example, when Alexander the Great was conquering the known world, he conquered Mediterranean, he moved on to India. When he came to India, he found that India was very easy to conquer. Why? Because they were just basically a bunch of little tiny city-states. And he could take them out. They were not unified as a people. They didn't have a single centralized power. And so for many years, that was true of India. But then there was a unification in, let's see, about 4th century BCE, I guess after Alexander the Great. Maybe 3rd century BCE, I guess, maybe 2nd century BCE, perhaps. That's where unification came. And this is also when Hinduism and Buddhism developed. Okay, so it's really important. All of a sudden, as Indian people come into their own unity, religions like Buddhism and Hinduism arise, and they arise, formally. Let's put it this way: Hinduism has always been around because it's a very ancient tradition, but they become more clarified. Their ideas now become expressed in written form. and Buddhism becomes a very clarified ideology, and then later becomes expressed in written form. So we've already studied Hinduism and Buddhism and how they're related, how essentially they both arise from the same milieu of the same people. But this is when this happens, at that moment of unification. And so for some time, Muslims come and take over India, and they rule for a while. Muslims ruled many parts of the world. And then that went on for quite a while until Europeans came. Europeans come, particularly the English, they take over India. They basically colonize India. They make it its own colony. And they go on to build their empire by basically ravaging the economy and the resources of Indian people. First, it began with trade, but as they took over, they just took what they needed from India. So that certainly wasn't good for Indian people, but it was good for England. So that's how that relationship worked. And so ultimately, Indian people revolted and gained their independence. In 1947, they formed a democratic republic. And unfortunately, when that happened, that whole land that used to be unified became split into India and Pakistan. So not one country emerged out of that event, but two countries. And that was a huge cultural divide that happened. So, of course, Pakistan is being Muslim. India is being primarily Hindu. Now, there are Hindus within Pakistan, and there are, Muslims within India. But majority-dominated populations of those two areas are split along the lines of their religious preferences. And that is still a huge religious tension that exists in both places. So Hindu and Muslims continue to strive with each other, continue to fight. There's a contention that goes on between Pakistanis and Indians that is very, very pronounced, even to outsiders. But they're the ones who truly understand what happened. Why? Because this is their history that happened to them. So there's deep cultural, let's say, problems that they are still trying to sort out. Okay, and so as a result, India is a very interesting country. One of the features of India that makes it really remarkable is the fact that what British people brought, with all the bad things, British people brought a unified language, because India was basically clans, and they had hundreds and hundreds of languages that they spoke in India. Every village had their own language, essentially. What England brought is English language. And all the people started speaking the same language. When they started speaking the same language, they started communicating, they created unity, and they were able to unify. And so English language is a big feature in India. A lot of people speak English in India because of the colonization, essentially. Of course, most people still speak their local native languages, whatever they may be, various, forms of Hindi, essentially. And there are many regional languages that people speak, but a big ability to speak English language essentially propelled India's ability to move forward economically, because being able to work with the West, and because Europeans brought European model of education into India eventually, that became the foundation of why we have so many Indian professionals today in information technology and trade, and it just really transformed. So America has trade relations with India, and now has established economic connections where so many services that America needs are provided in India. And the reason why is because they can speak English. So, and the same is partially true with Pakistan as well, although the relationship between America and Pakistan are a little bit different. But essentially, that is a huge plus for India that worked out in their favor. Their current economic development is partially due to the fact that what English brought as a side effect, the language in the education system. So there are a lot of issues in India. They have a lot of problems as everybody else, and they have their own problems. There are lots of educated people in India, and most of them have jobs outside of India. Many of them move. So there's a little bit of a brain drain, is what we call it. That means some of the brightest and the best people actually live in India and go work somewhere else and contribute to somebody else's society. So just think about how many Indians work in American Silicon Valley and American IT industry, creating programs and software and engineering, all sorts of great things. Why? Because they're educated and Americans are willing to pay them a lot of money. So they leave, they dislocate, and that creates a problem for a culture. India, out of all of because it's so populated, one of the problems is that it still has a huge amount of poverty. Poverty, even with all the smart people that are out there, with all the education that exists, there's still a lot of people who are uneducated. And that will always result in huge poverty problems. So you have basically 68% of the population lives in rural areas, so they're non-city dwellers. 30% illiterate. 30% of the population cannot read or write. That's massive. That means the only things that they can do is menial labor. That's it. There's no way unless people become literate, they're not going to be able to move up anyway in the world. So basically, you have massive poverty problems in India, partially because of the illiteracy, partially because of how many people there are and how the society is organized. There's a lot of corruption that goes on in the Indian government, a lot of mismanagement, huge bureaucracy. And so the infrastructure of Indian society, they cannot seem to handle it. Everything in India is falling apart, and that creates a big problem, for the people. They cannot create a good, strong, cohesive infrastructure, and so those problems continue to drag down their progress. So they have economic growth, and they certainly have a lot of production, but with production and with industrial revolution comes pollution. So again, lots of people, only so much land, and then pollution comes in. So there are some social cultural issues that hold back Indians in many ways. The whole entire caste system, for example, it was outlawed. You probably heard about the caste system. So Indians have different castes. There are lower castes, higher castes. That has to do with their religion as well. And they believe that whatever caste you're born into, that pretty much your destiny, kind of like karma. Think about that. We talked about dharma and karma, right, earlier as we studied Hinduism. And so the idea is that if you're born to be a worker, a lower caste, if your father was the janitor, that only thing you're going to ever do in life is be a janitor. And that's it. That is your karma. That is your destiny. Don't fight it. Do a good job being a janitor. Be the best janitor there is. And as you reincarnate in the next life, maybe you're born in a higher caste. You're going to be something else. So that belief, that idea, essentially, many people look at that, especially outsiders. It's easy for me to judge as an outsider. I'm looking at Indian culture from the outside, and I can say, okay, I can see how that will hold a person back. Where in America, anybody can become anything. In India, if you're born into this social environment, this is all you're ever going to do, and you're never going to achieve anything else. And your entire country, your entire society, and everybody tells you that. What do you think you're going to achieve if everyone around you tells you this is as good as you can do? Don't fight, don't strive, don't get educated, don't push. This is it. This is your lot in life. These are the cards that you've been dealt. So play that deck, and that's it. So it's very hard. And so the caste system is a bit of a discriminatory system where certain people from certain castes have certain privileges, and other people from other castes do not have those privileges. People still marry within the caste system. People still do business within the caste system. There's certain people of castes that simply would not associate with other castes. And even though it has been legally and formally outlawed, the system still functions because it's culture. You can't undo culture. You cannot cancel it out. It is people's faith. It's their culture. It's their way of life. And so even though, it may be legally outlawed, the discrimination between the castes still persists. And so they have a lot of problems. And some of them are cultural, some historical, some of them are economic. Every culture faces their own obstacles that set them back, essentially, as we each look at it. And we're all, in a way, outsiders, essentially. as we look at somebody else's culture, we always have that outsider perspective, but we could see something that maybe that they cannot even see themselves. But the whole point of this exercise is to help us understand who people are, so that we can basically better communicate with them. All right, almost there, almost at my goal. I want to highlight the Mexican culture, and then we will stop. All right, and we'll take a break. Okay, so you guys still with me? I know you're probably tired because I've been talking for a long time. But if you read the textbook, hopefully you can track with me, right? So, all right. So let's talk about Mexican and Mexican history. Let's see, Mexico. Mexico has a very colorful history. I mean, all these countries do, but so different, so unique. Basically, the authors make a point why studying Mexican history is important, why studying Mexican culture is important. It was because, well, for the United States, for Americans, it's actually essential. Why? Because these are your neighbors. These are people you deal with all the time. About 1 million of U.S. citizens live in Mexico. About 20 million of U.S. tourists go to Mexico every year. And about 14 million of Mexican tourists come from Mexico to U.S. And besides the fact is that there's about 33.7 million Mexicans, or as sometimes they're referred, Hispanics, reside in the United States since 2012 census, okay? And 22.3 million of those people were born in the United States. So that means so many people who are born in the United States actually come from Mexican heritage, okay? That is kind of where they're from, and that is still a big part of their culture, even if they were born in the United States. So there's a huge bleed over in between these cultures. And for people to ignore Mexican culture, to be oblivious to who these people are as a people, as a nation, as a culture, is not helpful at all, because there's no way you're going to go about in America and not encounter somebody from Mexico and have to deal with them in daily life. So it's practical to understand these things, where you might not bump into a Japanese, but you would definitely in America bump into a Mexican. That's just guaranteed, pretty much. Okay. So, and I know those of you guys from Brazil, I know you get lumped into the category with Mexicans. So I know, I understand that's not comfortable, but we know the difference. All right. So in this class we do. In other classes maybe not. All right. So we're talking about Mexico as a culture. There's several eras to Mexican culture that are very distinct, sort of say. There's the Pre-Columbian era that everybody needs to know about. That is actually huge. I mean, and it's, again, we are the historians, Western historians are the ones who decide how to teach Mexican history, which is hilarious, but that is such as life, We call it Pre-Columbian era, and we go from 300 BCE up to 1500s. That's a huge era. I mean, nobody's history is segmented into such big chunks, but that's Western history. That's how they do it. So what is typical of the Pre-Columbian era? Well, there's great civilizations like the Olmec and the Maya and the Aztecs who are existing basically in that territory, in that part of the world. And they are remarkable civilizations, that great builders, awesome culture, innovators in every way, that have developed their own unique societies, completely not having contact with Europeans or Chinese or Japanese or anybody. That they have their own unique cultures that are kind of built on themselves in isolation of other parts of the world. So and so when Mexicans talk about their pre-Columbian history, most Mexicans are very proud of that part, because that is a part of their heritage. Okay, there's this great and ancient history is very rich and very colorful. A lot of unique advancements, unique accomplishments that these ancient civilizations were able to achieve all by themselves, all independently. That's what makes it remarkable. So while people in Mesopotamia and in the Middle East are developing something, people in Mexico are also developing something of a similar sort, but they're doing it independently. So that's pretty cool. So then the second part of the Mexican history is tied to the Spanish Conquest, which, according to our textbook, began in 1519 with Hernando Cortez. So he invades the Yucatan Peninsula and starts to take over that part of the world. Now, again, you have basically tribal people living there, and tribal people can always be divided by very organized Europeans, because Europeans are on the same, kind of, they have certain unity. And so that's what they do, is they strike at disunity between the tribes and eventually get them divided, and eventually they conquer them. They're able to do that. So the military power that Spaniards bring are swords and guns and gunpowder and ships and armaments of things that, culture on the Yucatan Peninsula did not have. And they didn't have quite as organized of military and with that type of might. And so a lot of the war, and then starvation, and then disease, because Europeans brought diseases that people in Yucatan Peninsula have never experienced in their life. They had no immunities for. And so all of those factors wiped out about 90% of the population by 1650. 90% of the local population were absolutely ravaged by those things. Can you imagine taking over a country and 90% of the natives are gone? I can't even imagine that. That is a devastation. Like, how do you come back from that? To me, it's, and that is a part of Mexican history. That is a part of the history of this country where such incredible tragedy took over. So again, Spaniards and their expansion, that's really what that's about. Now, something that Spanish did is that very interesting, is that Spanish intermixed with locals very quickly, and they created, sort of say, segments of Mexican population that were now became very class-based, essentially, and a hierarchy and a structure of elite has emerged. Spanish language became the dominant language. They introduced the language. They introduced their religion, because they wiped out so much of the population. They were basically able to dominate. They introduced Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, as the main religion. And so local tribes, local people pretty much had to go along and accept it. And so colonization of Mexico basically created a very rigid social class system. And that created basically kind of like a European culture. They basically transported a lot of the European feudal culture now into Yucatan Peninsula. And basically Spanish occupation has transformed that entire part of the world. And so Mexicans, as a people, were subjugated by the Spaniards for a long, long time. Up until about 1800s, when people decided to fight back. And that's where the fight for Mexican independence really began. And eventually in 1824, Mexico was formed as its own republic with its own constitution. And but the historical connection with Spain and that legacy never really went away. So that continues on, and even until today. And there's still the class system that exists that is still left over of the old Spanish system that is still in Mexico. And so part of what makes Mexico Mexico is actually Spain. So that those two histories are now inseparable. You can't really take them apart. So the whole hierarchical structure is still a part of that. Now, interestingly enough, Mexico had a lot of interaction with the United States and their neighbors. So what a lot of Americans don't know this, and Mexicans probably know this more than Americans, is how much of America used to be Mexico. Okay, so states like California and Arizona and Texas were not American. They were part of Mexico. That basically Mexican-American War is what created the possibility of America basically purchasing those states for $15 million. But they took 55% of Mexican territory. So what happened is Mexico and America entered into a territorial war, and Mexico lost. And because Mexico lost, they had to concede, and they had to give up 55% of their land. So 55% of the land is that whole entire chunk of the United States. All used to be Mexico. And so essentially, they kind of technically bought it, but not. The money that they paid was really compensation for the suffering in the war and compensation for the destruction it caused. But basically, those states that we know today as part of the United States Confederacy were really part of Mexico. And Mexicans remember that history, and that's still a big painful part of that history. So basically, there is still a lot of mistrust among Mexicans because of that part of their heritage. All right, so very complicated history. Today, in a modern day, of course, Mexico and the United States enjoy a good relationship. In the 90s, trade relations were established between Mexico and the United States and Canada that made these countries very prosperous, and it continues to enjoy those relationships today, even though they were modified quite a bit under the recent administration here, but still very much so. Now, the authors, interestingly, talk about the contemporary and social problems of Mexicans, and they talk about that there's two primary causes that underlying problems, in Mexican culture. So they say that first is poverty and unemployment, especially in the rural areas, and that is basically nearly half of the population in Mexico are below poverty level or poverty. So poverty is one of the biggest problems in Mexico. Okay. And that's part of the reason why many Mexicans come to the United States to work so that they can supply their families with means. So there's a large amount of money flowing from the United States to Mexico to basically support people who are in poverty, family members who are in poverty. The other problem is violence and drug production that exists. Huge problem in Mexico. The cartels, the producers of drugs, are too strong, too powerful. They're corrupting the government. They're corrupting every fiber of Mexican society. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of power. They have weapons. And they are hurting Mexico as a country. And that corruption spreads to other levels of government. And as a result, people are not able to trust their own government because their own government are in cahoots with criminals. Let's put it that way. And so that makes it not a very good place to live. So it's another reason why a lot of people want to get out of Mexico and come to the United States, because they don't feel safe. They're surrounded by people where the rule of law does not exist, where the law are the drug lords. And nobody's going to do anything about them because, well, the government officials who could do something about them are being paid by the drug lords. So it's corruption, essentially. And so most people do not want to be around that because they feel hopeless and powerless to do anything against the cartels. So, of course, there is also a problem with overpopulation in places like Mexico City. There's huge ecological pollution problem. There's deforestation. There's a lot of erosion where a lot of the jungle is being cut away. So Mexico is ravaging its natural resources, partially because of the desperation and things like that. And production comes from the United States to Mexico. A lot of factories are being built. And that is a welcome sign because so many people are poor and they need the job. But at the same time, it's hurting Mexico as a country, and because they are creating disproportionate amount of pollution and changing their environment too fast in a negative way. So I think that happens with every society that turns more industrialized, and they do it too fast, and they cannot account for the changes ecologically. So anyway, so Mexicans have a number of big issues, but those two big ones being organized crime, violence, drugs, and just massive poverty. That's what's holding Mexico back, essentially, in many ways. At least from the outsider perspective, that's what we see. Okay. All right. So that was a long stretch. I hope you guys did not fall asleep on me. So, anybody wants to jump in on anything we talked about? I mean, I'm just going to open it up for a few minutes. What do you guys think? Is this a fair representation? What do you think about this? How the authors of this book presented the cultures and kind of highlighted some of their features? Is this fair? Is it unfair? What do you think? From your knowledge of these cultures and societies, how do you feel? Fair, unfair, good, bad, one-sided? You know, anybody?
For me, it's fair.
You think it's fair? Okay.
Yeah. I don't know everything about these cultures,
right.
But I think is fair as possible.
Okay. I mean, so the reason why I'm asking you, Matthias, is if there are parts of these cultures that you know or you had an opportunity and exposure, now how do you judge when something is fair or unfair? Okay, it's because you have exposure. It's because you can verify something that's true or not true. So while, for example, I can judge the American side, right? Because I know about Americans. I mean, I live in America, so I could say the part about America is pretty fair. It's pretty accurate. It's a good description of America. I thought it was well done. You know, I can talk about Russian history, and I can say, okay, they did a pretty good job. They actually quite fair. I was actually impressed when I read that section. I'm like, wow, they really hit it on the nail. So there's certain parts and there's certain cultures that I'm more familiar with that I can say they did a good job on. But I'm looking to you guys to tell me whether there are cultures that you know well, intimately perhaps, that you could say they did a good job or they didn't do a good job on that, because I want to know. You know, so like unless somebody tells me, I'm not an insider in those cultures, so it's hard for me to judge. So all right, go ahead.
I think like a Japanese culture. In my experience in Brazil there are a large Japanese culture and community, and they are so close for the other cultures. There are clubs and social activities just for Japanese.
That's right.
Yeah, there are baseball teams, but just Japanese
Japanese only.
Yeah. They are friendly, there are good people, but they don't mix with another culture.
They really don't. So you see that part of description of Japanese as being very accurate because you've experienced that. So this is the kind of confirmations I'm looking for. You know, is this description fair? Is this true? So thank you for confirming that to me. I mean, awesome. Anybody else? Just jump in.
Just a commentary. You told that the European countries opened the borders for immigrations, and since 2017, I'm a European citizen from Luxembourg. Yeah, but the government, they're like, oh, I have one more immigrant citizen, but the people won't be there. They don't like the immigrants.
Right. They need immigrants.
Right, yeah.
But they don't like immigrants.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is the difference between America and Europe. So what you're experiencing here at Adlison is essentially where Americans embrace people and they say, oh, whoever you are, you're nobody, come to our country. You can work hard and become anything you want. In Luxembourg, if I come and I work hard and I make some good money and I want to buy some property, there are people who will not sell me property because I'm not a local.
Yeah.
my money doesn't mean anything to them. Like, here, take millions of euros. And they're like, no, we're not selling it to you. We'll sell it to another guy who we know, whose family's been here for generations for the same money. But we won't sell it to you. Why? Because we really don't want you here. We don't want you spoiling our system. And we have a system. We have a club. We have this. And that, it is a big difference between Europe and America. And people don't realize that. In America, you can just, oh, you have the money. You buy the biggest mansion there is. And all of a sudden, you're friends with Donald Trump. You know, you go play golf with, you know, Kobe Bryant or something like that, you know, because you made it. Because you're neighbors. Because you live next door. And all of a sudden, you are in their class. The rich and the famous, you know, boom. Because you made it. In Europe, you can't do that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a big difference. So you're absolutely right, Addison. I've noticed that. I've heard that from many people who are in Europe, who are outsiders, who say, I cannot break into their society. They will not let me in. So as they're closed, you know, to the idea of foreigners, although they need foreigners to keep them going. Yeah, very true. Awesome. Great observation. Thank you for sharing that. All right, so there you are, citizen of Luxembourg. That's awesome. Great. All right, anybody else? All right, ladies and gentlemen. So let's take a little break. I'm going to let's take a break for about 10 minutes. Walk around, stretch out, do something. You know, get a coffee, run to the bathroom, grab a sandwich, whatever you got to do. Okay. Get a little break. I'll drink something because I've been talking forever, and then we'll hit Islamic civilization, and then we'll be done with the chapter. So it's, like I said, it's a big chapter, but I think it has so much to teach us about culture. You get these things, this will help you understand the world around you in such a better way. And in the end, the reason why we're studying is because we want to be better communicators. When I know you and you know me, it's so much easier for us to talk. Even if I don't know you personally, I know people like you from your environment who have all share these features, you know. And so without assuming too much, at least I know what not to say to make you all upset and offended at me, right? At least I won't hurt your feelings because I know a little bit about your culture and I'm not going to be disrespectful. So that's the idea. All right, so 10-minute break. It's 11:04 here on my clock, so I'll see you guys in 10 minutes. Just turn on, you know, just you can shut off your cameras or whatever. You know, don't exit out the session. Stay in there, and I'll be back and we'll reconvene. All right.